I'm KJ Rawson. I use he, him, his pronouns. As I start, I want to first give appreciation to everyone who's there and is helping to facilitate this. And hello to Beck, who is sitting at the panel for us in the front of the room. I also want to acknowledge that I live and work on the lands of the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, and the Nipmuc people. And I'd like to give appreciation for their continued presence and ongoing stewardship of this land. So I'm thinking that maybe we can actually start by introducing everyone on the panel so we won't interrupt ourselves later. Beck, would you like to go next? Sorry, I'm making you get to the mic.
That's okay. That's okay. Thanks, KJ. My name is Beck Schaefer. I am the cataloger at Osgoode Hall Law School Library at York University in Toronto.
Awesome. Thanks, Beck. Jades and then Sofia.
Hi, my name is Jades Heron. I'm a graduate student at Northeastern University's English department. I work at the DTA as a research assistant. My own specialized research is in medieval transgender identity. And in general, more broadly, I study identity as a whole, specifically looking at markers that might indicate a trans identity.
Hi, I am Sofia Arona. I am an undergraduate student at Northeastern University. And as Jades, I work at the DTA as a research assistant. And my pronouns are she, her.
Wonderful. Thank you all. So I'm not sure if I said, but I'm also at Northeastern University, and I'm the founder and director of the Digital Trans Archive, and I am the chair of the Homosaurus editorial board as well. So you can see from our preview slide here that we're going to do a little bit of jumping back and forth, but there's two main projects that we are going to be introducing during this panel. So the first is the Trans Metadata Collective. I'll give a bit of background on that, and then Beck is actually going to get into the weeds with us a bit and share some of the takeaways and recommendations that that group arrived at. Then we'll shift gears a bit and talk about the Digital Trans Archive. I'll give a bit of an overview, share a little about where the project is at right now, and then Jades will take over and talk about our current grant initiative and some of the big work we've been doing related to that. And then Sofia will get into some of the specific items and collections that we've been processing for that grant. So that's where we're heading today. And then we will have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. All right, so I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about the background of the Trans Metadata Collective. So the theme of our panel today is on representing trans people with care, and that's across lots of different information environments. So our work as a collective actually came about from connections we made 2 years ago at the Moving Trans History Forward conference. I know sometimes conferences can feel like fleeting connections, but in this case, it really started a meaningful and very productive collaboration. And I even did a little screen grab of the session that we had 2 years ago when Beck and I were also on the same panel. So we realized during those conversations that there are very few information professionals who have expertise in creating metadata for trans-related resources. So that was a problem. And at the same time, there's more resources that were being created and that needed to have accurate metadata applied to them. The existing best practices that we were aware of really had been developed on an ad hoc basis, which even may be generous because it was so informal. And often it's trans and non-binary people who would be stepping up to try to offer suggestions and best practices to our colleagues, oftentimes at like a lunch and learn or something really like casual within our own libraries and archives. But there had not been any broader conversations. There had been no attempt to coordinate on any of these efforts or collaborate. So we really saw that as an opportunity for improvement. So we formed the Trans Metadata Collective. After a few initial meetings right after the conference, we formally started gathering in May of 2021. And the Metadata Collective worked together for 13 months. It was a very productive group. We met with regularity, but not weekly or anything like that. What we did was we started a small group initially, and then we realized that we wanted to go beyond the few people who were in the room. So we launched a website, we created a Slack workspace, and we also circulated a broader call. We were overwhelmed by the response to that. We had well over 100 people who expressed interest in contributing to this work. If we were to kind of summarize who those folks were, they were predominantly non-binary, university-affiliated, white, Canadian, and US information professionals. Of course, that's the majority of the folks who were participating, but there was a really wide range of folks who came to share in this work with us. So we started a coordinating committee and a set of working groups. And by the end, the final draft was really pulled back together by 8 folks. And then we sent it back to the larger collective and got feedback and then continued drafting and revising it. So it was very much an iterative process. Our de facto leader, Bree Watson, put together this lovely little graphic, which can share a little bit about how the work got done and how we accomplished so much in such a short amount of time. So you can see that the convening committee was the original group that kind of inspired the work. And then we all split up into these working groups, which are the blue boxes below that. So we had working groups on descriptive practices, ethical recommendations, name authorities and access, and subject headings and authorities. And then each of those groups, you can sort of see from the lighter gray boxes underneath, did different types of work to help coordinate best practices and recommendations. And then all those got filtered into the coordinating committee, which was made up of representatives from each of the working groups. So it turned out to be a really productive structure. And within 13 months, we were able to put together the best practices that we then released. So I think I'll leave it there for Beck to take over and actually start delving into some of our outcomes.
How's my sound? Good. Okay, so our document was called Metadata Best Practices for Trans and Gender Diverse Resources. We posted it on Zenodo, which is an open research repository. Since we posted it in June of 2022, it's had over 10,000 downloads. We've been promoting it at conference presentations and workshops, primarily library and archives conferences. As far as implementation goes, we've heard back from folks that they've been inspired to undertake some name change remediation projects in their institutions. University of Michigan has incorporated the recommendations into their library cataloging workflows. It's having influence within the program for cooperative cataloging. That's an organization that works alongside the Library of Congress to set cataloging policy. And the group has continued as the Queer Metadata Collective. So there's been a change in membership and a change in focus, but it is continuing in that form. Next slide, please. So before I get started into the best practices, I thought I'd say a few words about metadata. So this is information about library and archival resources. So that can be things like books, online media, historical records, anything like that. That helps users find what they're looking for. So if you go to a library catalog site or an online repository like the DTA, you'll be searching the metadata. It allows you to filter your results as well. So maybe by date or format, and then you'll get information about each resource, and that is also metadata. So metadata can include information that's been transcribed directly from the resource. So generally speaking, we copy the title and the author's name, information like that directly off the resource. It can also include added descriptions or added keywords. In some cases, the keywords are more standardized and come from a standard subject terminology, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. We also use standardized forms of names. So if someone's changed their name, we do have one standardized form just to draw all their works together under one name. Also, if you have 2 people with the same name, we add a little bit of information just to distinguish between those 2. Next slide. So within that metadata framework, we considered trans and gender diverse resources, which we defined as being sort of about trans and gender diverse people, about transness and gender diversity, or more broadly about gender, but that acknowledges that gender is not a limited binary. So we recognize that gender identity terminology will vary according to person, according to culture and language, and according to historical periods. And there's such a variation in terms because there are distinct ideas about gender. So there's not like an equivalent translation necessarily from one language to another or from one time period to another. We also recognize that gender identity terminology may be private. This could be a case of on an individual level, someone just doesn't want to disclose their gender identity. It could be a cultural term that's sort of limited to in-group use. And we also recognize that gender identity may be relevant to a resource, but there's no specific terminology on the resource. So particularly around visual resources, there may not be any terminology there. Next slide, please. So we came up with two sort of general recommendations. First of all, to prioritize self-identification and description. In a lot of cases, that information is going to be on the resource itself. In other cases, we said, you might have to consult or collaborate with groups. We provided some guidelines and resources on how to do that in a reciprocal and respectful way, particularly with non-Western cultural groups and Indigenous communities. We also suggested that if you don't know the identification terms, describe what you're seeing rather than assuming. So with visual resources, describe what's in the picture rather than giving it a label. And we also recommended providing context around like who chose the terminology, why did they choose it, what does it mean in its historical or cultural context, and if there's sort of limitations on how the term should be used, include that information as well. Next slide. So we also looked at terminology within the Library of Congress subject headings, or LCSH. This is a widely used subject vocabulary that defines a preferred term for each concept, and you'll put the preferred term into the metadata. And so even having the idea of a system that has preferred terminology, that bumps up against the idea of self-identification. And unfortunately, LCSH, the preferred terms that it has are sorely lacking. It under and misrepresents transness and gender diversity. Within the preferred terminology, it only recognizes 4 non-cisgender identities. So two-spirit, gender non-conforming, transgender, and transsexual, and that's it. It also conflates ideas of sex and gender. So any concepts around gender, the preferred term will usually use the word sex. And finally, the preferred term for LGBTQ is sexual minorities, which, is not a common term. And again, there's some trans and gender diverse erasure there. So in the best practices, we did include an overview of what's actually out there that people can use in terms of the LCSHs. But we also gave some strategies to address problems because there are so many. So we recommended supplementing with alternative vocabularies like homosaurus. This has way more than 4 gender identity terms. And as well, it's something that can really be easily be integrated into traditional library metadata. We also recommended proposing changes to LCSH and included some resources on how to do that. I'm also happy to report that since we published our document in June, there's a new group formed called the SACO Gender and Sexuality Funnel Project. And that group is devoted to creating and revising LCSHs related to transness and queerness. And I know that they've been in conversation with the Library of Congress about that issue of preferring the term sex to gender and about making some changes to the sexual minorities heading. And we also finally recommended retaining terms used in the resource. So you may have noticed that non-binary is not one of those preferred terms. So if I were cataloging a book about non-binary people, I'd make sure that the word non-binary was in the metadata as much as possible so people would still find it if they search the term non-binary. Next slide. So we also looked at name changes because it's fairly common for trans people to change our names. And we identified a couple of potential issues around name changes. So I mentioned earlier that the author's name is transcribed from the resource itself, but their name can change after they've published. And I also mentioned those standardized forms of names, and the library community is pretty good about keeping the standardized forms up to date. There are many people working on that. And so, somebody will announce a name change on Twitter. It will probably get changed within the next 2 days. But then you still have their former name. So then you've got metadata where you're seeing somebody's current name and their former name together. So we wanted to address that as well, but we wanted to make sure that any recommendation we gave in that area would allow for someone's entire body of work to be accessible using their current or preferred name. Because people should get credit for everything they've done, not everything they've done under their current name. So a recommendation for this was to follow a person's preference for name usage. And we encourage people to ask them. We did include some etiquette guidelines on emailing people about gender-related name changes. And we recommended that if you don't know a person's preference, use the most recent name consistently and avoid public use of the former name. You would often have to use the former name in sort of a behind the scenes way just to allow for that linking. The best practices document also includes lots of domain specific recommendations for names in library cataloging. So that follows the major cataloging standards of MARC and RDA. So if you're interested in those technical details, that information is in there. Next slide, please. So we also recognize that there can be harmful content in metadata, and it can get in there in different ways, and that requires different approaches. So in some cases, there's intentional transphobia in library and archival resources. As much as we would like there not to be transphobic books, there are. So we recommended in that case being explicit and specific about the nature of the content. So if I were working on a video that was advocating conversion therapy, I'd include that note in the metadata. So someone looks it up, they see that information about it, they can see that this video is going to be advocating conversion therapy. And at that point, they decide they don't want to watch it. Rather than getting halfway through, discovering it's advocating conversion therapy, it's just an easier way to help people find what they're looking for. Also, self-ascribed slurs and historical language can be harmful. But again, we recommended maintaining that with context because we do want to respect people's self-identification, respect the historical context, but we also have to provide information. So, let people know that this is a self-ascribed slur, both this is the way someone identifies and that this term is a slur. So be careful how you use it. Finally, we recognize that in some cases, the transphobia just comes from outdated language in the metadata, or it's come from somebody who's creating metadata who, for whatever reason, is not being as careful. Maybe it's intentional. So in that case, we recommended either correcting the metadata or contextualizing it, depending on what kind of metadata it is. Next slide, please. So the issue of outdated metadata sort of led us to create some recommendations around metadata processes. So we recommended assessing metadata regularly. So just kind of identifying what resources your institution has around transness and gender diversity, making a plan to sort of periodically check that to make sure the language is still fairly current. We also had a recommendation to be proactive about making changes. So if you see something that needs changing, go ahead and make that change. We recommended being consistent. This is particularly important with names. A lot of institutions will have more than one system. For example, where I work, we have the library catalog. We also have an institutional repository with faculty scholarship. So if you're changing names, they have to be changed in all the systems that you have. We also recommended being transparent about metadata creation. I think this is a good recommendation just for metadata folks in general. So tracking the changes you're making, implementing versioning, documenting what you're doing, and making that documentation public as much as possible. And that will allow people who are using the metadata to sort of understand where it's coming from, why you've made certain terminology choices, why there's certain information there, why certain information isn't there. And finally, we recommended seeking out and responding to feedback. So you can have a suggestion form on your website, let people know that they can email you if they have concerns about the metadata, but also incorporate it into your workflows that you're going to be checking that suggestion box. Make a plan for how you're going to address those suggestions. So that's sort of an overview of the metadata best practices for trans and gender diverse resources. KJ and I can answer any questions afterwards, and I will turn it over to the Digital Transgender Archive part of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Beck. That was such a great summary of a pretty technical document. So hopefully it will inspire many people to go back to the resource and get involved with the continuing community if it's of interest. So I'm just going to spend about 5 minutes or so introducing the Digital Trans Archive in case any folks aren't familiar with it, and sort of give you an update on where things are at with the project right now. So what I did on this slide was just shared with you our top level mission statement. You can see here, and not only because I put it in a slight bold, that accessibility is central to the work of what we do. So the DTA is a freely available online archive for digitized historical materials. We also include some born digital content. And we also include lots of discovery resources for collections that are not yet digitized. So that's what the last part of that mission statement is about. This is our scope statement. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially what we do is we shift from transgender as an identity to transgender as a practice of transgressing gender norms. And this probably isn't surprising to anyone in this audience, but what we're trying to do with this shift is make sure that we are bringing in as many resources as possible that capture all of the complicated ways that people have transgressed gender norms throughout human history and across a variety of cultural contexts. So you can see in the last sentence of our scope that we do focus on pre-2000 content, which is not that long ago for a cutoff because we'll collect anything else before that. But we try to really focus the resources that we do have on materials that are more difficult to find and things that may be a bit more hidden than things that were created in the last 23 years. We are global in focus, but certainly our collections are really predominantly US and Canadian. Here's a very quick top-level overview of the project. If you haven't visited the site yet, it's at digitaltransgenderarchive.net and a few other affiliated domains, so it should be fairly easy to find. We launched it in January of 2016, so the project has been live for over 7 years now, which is just mind-boggling to me. It's like watching your children age, right? So all of our materials are actually contributed by institutions from 10 different countries. And we have 74 different collaborators who have added content to the site, which is just phenomenal. We are still adding new contributors with a fairly regular basis. So the way that we include content is through digitization. Some of that occurs on site at our collaborating institutions' locations. Sometimes our collaborators will send materials out to have professional digitization services handle it. And then other times we'll do it in our lab. There are some cases when it's local-ish where we will actually travel to a collaborator and digitize on site. But that's becoming less and less common. We did that a lot more at the start of the project. I should, of course, also mention that the University of Victoria Transgender Archives is one of our partners and has been from the start of the project. So you can see here that we have over 10,400 items available on the site right now. On the one hand, that seems like a fabulous amount of content, and I'm always excited as that number continues to grow. On the other hand, I think it's important to know that that is just a minuscule amount of content compared to what could be included in our collections. So it's always helpful to know that whatever you find on the site is great and wonderful, but there's so much more out there. Our content does go back to the 16th century, but I always feel like I'm misrepresenting the collections a bit. Jades will probably laugh at me a bit for that because those earlier items really are outliers. The majority of our collections are from the second half of the 20th century. And that's in part because we've really tried to focus our resources on materials that are created by people who are transgressing gender norms as opposed to materials that are about folks who are transgressing gender norms. And then the last bullet point is about the types of materials we have. So you'll find all sorts of things, but right now photographs are our top item, and then clippings are next, and newsletters are the third. And this is my last slide. I wanted to share with you all a bit about the project that we are currently working on. So we were very fortunate to be awarded a 3-year grant from the Council on Library and Information Resources. And this is a 3-year initiative focused on trans-BIPOC digitization. So that is all that we are doing as a project for a 3-year period. We are doing this work with 10 collaborators across the US and Canada. And you can see from the third bullet point what the outcomes of this project are. So we are digitizing over 20,000 pages of mixed archival materials, around 600 images, and 22 AV items. And we are well on our way, though we have a lot more work to do still. We also are trying to create the resources that are mentioned in the last point here, which is that we're developing a short podcast series, a video series, and several lesson plans to support the uptake and the engagement with the content that we are digitizing for the grant. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'll pass it over to Jades to do the next section and share some of the work we've been up to.
Thank you. Reason why KJ said that I might laugh at him is, as I mentioned earlier, I am a trans medievalist. And so there are bits of history, obviously, going all the way back then in which we are existent, and of course, gender is being transgressed. So the initiative that I was brought in on, as KJ talked about, was about representing, but also highlighting the BIPOC examples, historical examples of this sort of transgression. And what I was tasked with first was to consider the scope and how we capture transgender histories. This, of course, is definitely very complicated because you start to ask questions about what does it mean to be transgender? What does that exactly look like? And the purpose of the scope was to capture as many items as possible that might be presented or given to us or recommended to be added to the Digital Transgender Archive. And so as I was brainstorming through this process, there were several questions that came up. Another question was because transgender is a modern term, how do we sort of see it historically and also continue to be accurate? So what is transgender and what is the point of unification that is seen across the identity within these different historical items and documents that would reveal that there is this gender transgression that is happening? Next slide. So as KJ mentioned, the way that we approach at the Digital Transgender Archive, the way that we actually approach is seeing transgender or transness as an action in a way. And so looking at gender transgression as the marker or the indication of a possible, whether it be trans identity, but in a more broader sense, transness in general. And so there are several things that you have to consider when actually trying to do that. You have to consider the time in regards to this gender transgression that you might see. For example, you might see someone who is a cross-dresser or someone who is performing theater, vaudeville, for example, in a historical context. You might see these people, and whether or not their actual identity is tied up with what they're doing is, of course, a big question. We don't have a time machine, so obviously we can't actually like tell. However, we can sort of kind of get an indication of whether or not this is a identity or something that is more core to them by, for example, how long they might actually participate in this transgression. Is it something that they do at home? Is it something that they continue even outside of, as I said, for example, the vaudeville or the performance? And so you have to go through these several considerations when you look at the gender transgressions that happen throughout like history. So, like I said, time is one aspect. Another aspect, which is definitely incredibly important, especially considering that our initiative, is of course the cultural aspect. And so how we often look at and examine the world is from a Eurocentric, white sort of perspective. And so because it is so easy for us to look at the world through that lens, we often define gender transgression through that lens as well. And so within these circumstances where the participant is BIPOC or part of a different sort of culture, what counts as gender transgression there is also something else that must be considered and thought about as you go through identifying gender transgression historically. The situation is another aspect. Is this something that the person who is transgressing gender, is this something that they volunteered for? Is this something that was forced on them? Is this something that was a necessity in order for them to survive or to exist in some, way, shape, or form? Is there an identity claimed? Do they actually state who they are? Do they actually state, oh, I identify as this gender or that gender or not? And then even in terms of relations, because in terms of items that we do receive at the DTA, sometimes they can honestly even just be buttons, images of specific shirts or other things that are related to gender transgression or related to people who do transgress gender. And it's important to also have these items as well for historical documentation. Next slide, please. So, in terms of how to actually capture transgender histories, we developed a scope flowchart. I sort of liken it more to a web. And the reason why I liken it to the web or to a web is the purpose of it is to actually capture specific items. So we want the web to actually flag or capture specific items that are run through it. So as it goes down the web, eventually we can say, yes, this item belongs in the Transgender Archive, or no, this item doesn't belong in the Transgender Archive. And so it's a series of questions that kind of build upon and lead to the next in order for us to say which ones we're including and which one is not. It's not only a guide for us at the Digital Transgender Archive so that we can sort of look at the items and say, okay, this is something that does belong here, but it's also a potential resource for our partners so that they can also determine if they have an item or a recommendation for an item or anything like that. They can also look at this document and determine, oh, this is something that belongs in the Digital Transgender Archive or something that doesn't belong there. Next slide, please. And so what I wanted to do in regards to this flowchart or web was I wanted to highlight a couple of very important aspects of it and important like questions that are within this web. So one of the highlights that I want to bring up was gender transgression. Of course, gender transgression, as KJ brought up earlier, is something that is really, really crucial or core to our identifying materials that belong in the archive. And one could almost say that in many ways, what we do track in the Digital Transgender Archive is gender transgression. So it is very fundamental and core to what we do. And so one of the things I wanted to like highlight was like this question. So is this item about or does it contain a person or people transgressing, gender norms, as it is like a core fundamental question. However, even with this question, we have to also acknowledge that even if this gender transgression isn't present, it's still possible that there will be other trans identities outside of that, or that aren't like visibly apparent. And so that is to say that this scope document is not a limiting document. It is more akin to a suggestion document in terms of whether or not an item belongs or not. The next portion that I wanted to highlight was, does the transgender practice serve a specific cultural function or purpose? And so this is a question, of course, once again, relating to our BIPOC initiative, to make sure that if there is an identity that might appear gender transgressive to us, that we do also consider the culture in which this act is happening or taking place. Thanks, sorry. The other question, of course, was, is this a sustained practice? Which was something that I did also mention before earlier as well. So then the last one I want to bring up was the relation question. Again, this is something that I did bring up in our last slide about whether or not items are related or not to a specific gender transgressive event, person, or specific act. Next slide, please. Another thing to consider, even outside of the scope and capturing which items belong in the Digital Transgender Archive or not, is also thinking about whether or not we should actually include these items, or do they present a threat in terms of privacy. So there are things obviously on there on a specific item. For example, it could out someone if the person happens to be someone who is, you know, alive, but they aren't out, or they are alive, but they're still in the closet, etc. Like there are several different reasons why it's very important that we do look or we do consider privacy. And so we created a document that is like a series of questions that also sort of outline, okay, like what exactly what do you think the outcome would be if we did expose this item, as in if we did put it on the Digital Transgender Archive, how that might affect the legacy of the item, the legacy of the person who is within the item, the legacy of the event that is happening in the item. And it is a way for us to, obviously, we want to provide as much information and as many items as possible to give as many examples as possible. But we also, of course, want to protect people in terms of their personal information, in terms of like the point of view this item is being told from, whether it be someone writing an article about a specific gender transgressive person and where they might stand in terms of how they feel about people who cross-dress or who are queer in this way or gender transgressive. Next slide, please. So ultimately, there are, of course, other factors that do go into us deciding whether or not something should be put on the Digital Transgender Archive. We do look at the scope, we do look at privacy concerns, but then also we do sort of have a more global or overall sort of look at things in terms of determining whether or not they actually belong on the archive. And I'll turn it over.
Hopefully everyone can hear me. I will try to project as much as possible. But so in this section, I wanted to take some time to talk and show how all of the policies and practices we just spoke about kind of come into play when actually dealing with a collection. And specifically, I wanted to touch upon some of the big picture questions that frame the process of taking items and uploading them onto our site, and kind of show how certain examples of how these questions actually are discussed and come, as I said, into play. And so and to provide some context, we used an example. So the example that I chose is the Randy Wicker archive. And to provide some context onto who Randy Wicker is and why we're dealing with these items. So this is our items that we're taking from our collaboration with the LGBT Center in New York. And Randy was a very prominent leading figure in the early gay rights movement in the 60s in New York. And through his activism, he met a lot of people, including figures like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, which are very important in terms of our scope and the work that we do at the DTA. And in fact, Randy and Marsha were roommates from 1980 until 1992 when she died. So their close connection and relationship provides a lot of kind of important context and makes the items that are part of the collection very important to us. Because unlike a lot of things that we deal with, they're coming from, well, not that perhaps directly the trans people themselves, people that were closely related, which adds a lot of value. In terms of also not just representing the big historical and quote unquote revolutionary moments, but just the everyday kind of joys of trans life, and kind of in a much more, I guess, casual, but still very beautiful way. And it's something that also I think it's very important nowadays. And one of our first kind of concerns that we have is that of balancing our need to be historically accurate with this idea of and our commitment to representing trans people with care. And this comes it becomes especially important as we are a historical archive. And as was already mentioned by KJ, the vast majority of items we deal with, and so the vast majority of trans related historical materials are not authored by the people or the groups that they are about. And so this sets up a very problematic dynamic a lot of times when we deal with these items. And the Wicker archive, to use as an example, is, as I mentioned, sits in like kind of between, because while it is not authored by a lot of people. So a lot of the clippings are included, a lot of the journal entries, the correspondence is not necessarily authored by the people the trans people that they are about, they're still coming from a circle of people that knew. And so we're getting a perspective that is far better than, say, a newspaper article written by a journalist that has never met anyone. And so this also comes into question with the idea of like the different sources. So how is a newspaper article different from a journal entry or a letter sent between two people? And these are all kind of these bigger picture questions that we deal with in terms of deciding how do we include an item? And if so, how do we include it? And how do we add metadata? And how do we create descriptions that contextualize and also explain why this item is there, but also mitigate the chances of it having harmful or perhaps incorrect kind of information in there, which leads us to the question again of like, what do we do when we have an item that is not a beautiful photograph of Randy and Sylvia and her partner Julia just sitting there posing, but we are dealing with perhaps, like in this collection, there's a lot of articles that came out around Marsha's death. And so those a lot of times include just kind of really awful language, transphobic language, just racist language. And so how do we deal with items like that? Because on one hand, it is really important that we do not sanitize or censor history and that we include items in their original format and their original form, because that also says a lot about the historical context and provides a lot of information as to what was happening at the time. And we don't want to pretend that that wasn't happening. So we want to include those materials. And sometimes, but we also realize that a lot of times we don't want visitors to our site to just consume really like awful materials. And so the way we deal with that a lot of times is through our harmful content policy and our descriptions, which I hear Cage's voice in my head saying descriptions don't have to be neutral, and they don't. And this is like a very good place where we kind of learn how, if, for example, an article is using racist language, we add the content warning and we make sure that we not only identify what that language is, but also make sure to correct it in case, for example, it's talking about using the incorrect name or the incorrect pronouns when referring to a person. And yes, we can move on to the next slide. Yes. Another big part of our efforts deal with terminology, which is a really big part. And so how do we decide? We kind of heard about how metadata is created, but how do we decide as people processing these items and actually having to tag and choose metadata to add to every item that we process? How do we make those decisions? And one of the very important things that we take into consideration is obviously self-representation and self-identification. So we try our best to listen to the voices of trans people and non-binary people who are the subjects of these items when trying to represent them and add metadata to our items. Unfortunately, a lot of things come into play, as was kind of discussed, and one of them being, for example, different historical context. So terms that were perhaps used even just in like the times of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, so like the 80s and the 90s, are no longer applicable, or we see them with our 2023 eyes as no longer applicable. And this, in fact, is something that has come up repeatedly, especially with Marsha recently on platforms, even like Twitter. There's been like long debates of, when you use something like drag queen to describe Marsha, there's a lot of people that are really uncomfortable or find themselves to be upset by this because they feel like that term is outdated and perhaps derogatory. But what do we do as an archive if we have items where Marsha herself uses those terms to describe herself? And that kind of complicates everything, because on one hand, we do want to take into consideration kind of this more label and like terminology driven approach to trans representation that we see in the present. But at the same time, we don't want to take the agency and the little agency and kind of the little space that these people like Marsha had to express themselves and identify themselves and represent themselves. And so we try to, as was said before, even just choosing metadata, we try to prioritize self-representation. And a lot of times the question comes, yes, but if they were alive today, they probably wouldn't choose that term. And while perhaps that may be true, and perhaps they may have used different terms and they wouldn't identify as drag queens anymore and would just choose something else, by choosing that something for them and by making that decision for them, we're kind of complicit in the part of erasing their voices. And so we want to really make sure that we try our best not to. And we try really hard to listen to what the sources are. And this also comes into play with harmful language or terminology. Even if it's like slurs that are being used by the people themselves, we try perhaps to include it or provide context in our best way we can, so that the viewer, the visitor, understands what they're getting into before reading the context, but also understanding that at the end of the day, our policy is to uplift those voices and not kind of our present mentality of what labels mean and our kind of current definitions, because we are a historical archive at the end of the day. So that is what we do. But yes, we can go to the next slide. Yes.
I just want to remind you to possibly think about 5 minutes if you want to have 15 minutes for questions, or 10 minutes if you just want to have 10. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm almost done. Amazing. So, and I think with the Wicker Archive, especially, one of the big things and one of the big picture questions that comes up, and this is not, unfortunately, not only limited to this collection and this set of items, but is something that is very common when we deal with trans history, is what are the implications of white voices narrating BIPOC history. So Randy Wicker is a white man, and he collected in the majority of the subjects that he dealt with. So a lot of in the photographs, the people that were around him, and a lot of the content that we have from his personal collections is of people of color. And so what do we do in that instance? How do we, and there is no easy answer, and we haven't answered the big question just like that. We're not claiming that we did, but a lot of times we have to really be wary and kind of really think of what that means for us and what that means. And so one of the things that we were just recently talking about was, do we create a full collection under like Randy Wicker's name, or do we kind of decenter him from the collection and try to highlight perhaps the people that are in that are depicted and that are being represented, rather than him and the person who is kind of giving and narrating, or being kind of the puppeteer like behind and trying to like give us all of these things. And this is sometimes extremely difficult because a lot of the things are obviously narrated through his voice. We have a lot of the newsletter and a lot of kind of the items about Marsha are letters written by him to his friends describing Marsha. And so we're trying our best to provide context as to that. And so make sure that the people that know that that item is not an absolute truth about Marsha, but is written and who is written by, and kind of just contextualizing so that we're understanding where it comes from. And we are trying our best to not make Randy the god of Marsha, or any of the people that are being represented. And this is something that expands way past just this collection. And is something that we see because like the majority actually of our items come from not BIPOC people. And so, but a lot, even the ones that are about BIPOC people. So just on a question, again, I've not answered the big question, but this is something that is remains in our minds when we deal with collections, especially under the grant, and especially when we also questions of privacy, for example, come into play. This is all I have to say.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. That's our thank you slide and our question slide.